Okay, welcome back to another episode of Storytelling Deconstructed. After much fiddling with the technology and cursing of the gods, we are ready to start. Today we have a really special guest. We have Sarah Anthony. Sarah is a total badass. She's one of my favorite people I've met in Hollywood. She's worked on a ton of cool projects. She's worked on the TV show Making a Murderer. She's worked on the documentary series Why We Fight. She's also worked on the HBO documentary series The Defiant Ones, about the collaboration between Jimmy Iovine and Dr. Dre. She's worked on the movie The Price of Free and on Bikram, Yogi Guru Predator. So we're super pumped to have her here. Anybody have anything to add? All right, roll the intro music. All right, cool. So let's start off. Basically, I usually like to start off by just asking this question as a sort of to warm us up. Why is this movie great?
For me, this movie is one of the quintessential depictions of modern isolation. I've rarely seen a film that captures it quite as well as this one does. Obviously, when we start talking more about the craft, we'll talk more about the techniques it uses in order to get that feeling, but every moment of this movie just has the stench of loneliness throughout the whole thing. And perhaps the most amazing part of it is people might think that the fact that it's in Japan would be the main reason why it is that way. But I would argue that that's not the reason why. But maybe other people disagree with me.
I don't disagree with you on that. But for me, the reason why this movie is great is because it just breaks all the rules and conventions that I thought a movie had to have. And I was just like, oh, you can make a movie like that?
Yeah, totally. It definitely does a lot of weird stuff. So let's dive into that. I mean, like, what rules is it breaking?
Okay, well, I don't know if this is actually even a rule, but I specifically noticed, I was like, wow, 30 minutes into the film before the main characters even speak to each other.
That's right. You know what it reminded me of? Because I actually wrote, the exact words I wrote in my notes are that this first act of the film are just like a bunch of vignettes. And it reminded me of the book To Kill a Mockingbird. You know how the first third of that book is just almost like a series of like one-off tales that are related to the main theme of that whole book. But in the same way, the first act of this movie were just a bunch of vignettes of loneliness. Whereas almost you're watching it and it's like any other film director would have cut a lot of the little scenes that were in the first part of this movie. One that immediately comes to mind is the one where Bill Murray is all alone doing the elliptical in the gym.
No, I love that.
And it's going too fast and he gets a cramp in it. That is not at all consequential to the movie except that he's limping the next day.
Yeah.
It's just this delightful... one thing I forgot was how funny this movie is. Bill Murray is hilarious in this movie.
This whole movie is hilarious.
It's so funny. But beside, like, any other director would have either cut that scene or they would have purely just played it for comedy. Whereas it added to the feeling of just like building up this guy's isolation.
Yeah.
And there were many scenes like that. For instance, another one of the more hilarious scenes was when, I don't know, did they send a prostitute to his room? How did the prostitute get to his room?
Yeah, they sent her.
Okay, because that was another one-off scene that was so funny. I was laughing so hard. But the other time, like, my heart was aching for Bill Murray because it's just like so awkward and he's just not into it at all. And she's doing all this like weird, like I don't even know what kink you have to be into the type of stuff that she's doing. But
I know.
It's just like, whoa. Oh man, it made me feel lonely even though like she was presumably going to have sex with him. So.
Yeah, you're right. And that's why the title is so perfect. And I wonder when in the writing process they came up with the title, because it really just is one moment after another. And it's even between the people who speak the same language, there are moments that are lost.
Yeah, which is really the genius of this movie. Which the surface level is that it's about the being in Japan and the cultural divide that is the result of the alienation. But then like you've realized that like that's actually not the issue at all, and the real alienation is coming in the characters' personal relationships that has nothing to do with Japan, and they actually end up by the end of the movie almost. They start to relate to Japanese culture, and they start to fit in a little bit. They start to embrace it a little bit, and it actually ceases to be the strongest source of the alienation.
And one of the strongest relationships was with his wife, who we never see. But that the moment where the very first time he opens a piece of paper and she's like, you're missing your son's birthday. And I'm sure he won't, I can't even remember what it says, but it was so cold. And you learn so much.
The motif of Bill Murray's wife's passive-aggressive messages just like wore on me for the whole film. It's just like, imagine having an important relationship with someone where everything that they say to you is just like it has a little bit of a dig to it. So like, from that first fax message where it's just like, you missed your son's birthday, no big deal. That's not the exact words, but that's what I got out of it. And then it's just like, oh yeah, I'm going to send you these burgundy patches. It's no big deal. It's just the carpet for your study. Like, whatever. Do it when you have some time, like hot shot.
And the line where she goes, should I be worried about you? And he goes, only if you want to. It was just like, oh, everybody wants someone to worry about them. I don't know if that's true, but you know what I mean? Like, he's like, you don't, so why are you asking me?
Right. I want to talk about some of the more rules that it breaks, because I totally agree. I think there's a ton of rules that it breaks. But the main one that we're talking right now is structure. It does some weird stuff structurally. So one of the things is, as we were talking about, it has this long intro where there are a lot of vignettes that aren't necessarily immediately connected to or developing of the plot. Another thing, though, that I think was really interesting structurally is that it had this, and it had this almost maybe like the last third of the movie. It had this recurring thing where you kept thinking that the movie was going to be over, and then it wasn't. And I have found this to be a really effective technique pretty much all the time. Like, it just always works every time I see this, where an easy, I shouldn't even say easy, an effective way to overcome the problem of cliched plots. Like, that's a problem we all deal with as writers. Every plot has been done. We all have the archetypal structure of those plots in our, blazoned into our brains. Is you get to the end, get to what is supposed to be the end, and then keep going. And this movie had like 3 or 4 false endings, which I felt like were extremely effective. Do you guys want to? Did you guys have the same experience? And if so, you guys want to talk about that?
I absolutely had the same experience because you think that the movie's going to end when Bill Murray does his passive aggressive call to Scarlett Johansson, where he says, "Hey, you left your jacket at my room. I'd like to see you again if you'd like to return it, but if not, it was nice seeing you and thanks for stealing my jacket." And you think like, all right, it's going to leave you in that feeling. They're just not going to see each other again. And then she shows up the next morning to return the jacket, and you think, oh, this is going to be the release that I want. This is going to pay off these feelings that I've been having this whole movie. But then she just returns the jacket, and they share like a quick hug. It didn't feel like a resolution either. So then you think, oh, that's even more heartbreaking, that it's like it teased you with what you wanted, and that's going to stop there. And then it's like, okay, he's going to get in his cab and go to the airport. But no, then the final time he's in the cab and he sees Charlotte walking down the street, and that's when finally Sofia Coppola gives you what you want for the whole movie, where he runs after her and they have that shared moment, and he whispers that thing into her ear that we'll never get to know what it is. And she cried. Whatever it is, it really stirred her up emotionally because she started weeping after he said it. And so it's like, finally, it's just like, oh, that's what I was waiting for. And it was just so satisfying. I almost don't care what he said to her.
I feel like the thing that she's constantly like teasing there, because I mean, this is something that I say a lot, which is that like, you know, like stories are not about what happens, they're about what it means. And you know, the whole dramatic question of this movie is, what does their relationship mean? And she keeps threatening us, and I feel like that is the right word, threatening. She keeps threatening the viewer with the idea that it doesn't mean anything. It's just a friendship, and a passing one at that. And that's what I think is so devastating. After he sleeps with the singer, and then they the next time they see each other, he shakes her hand, and that's sort of like cementing. That's like a moment where it's like a damning cementing of the idea that like, this is just platonic. It's not actually that significant, and it feels damning.
Yeah, but then he or Coppola, whoever, sets us free at the end with the moment where they walk away from each other, and you know that they're going on with the thing that they had been so lost in, right. And they're going to be okay.
Right, exactly. Well, and that's what feels so good about the ending, is that like it finally tells us like, no, this was meaningful. This was really important. And despite their, and frankly, you know, Bill Murray character's attempt to make it not, or pretend that it wasn't.
Yeah.
And one thing I thought was interesting was he says something at the end. He says, we'll start a jazz band. So I think it's the same scene as the handshake. And to me, that was echoing the first interaction they had, which was where he goes, I'm staging a jailbreak. Do you want in?
Yes.
It was this grand fantasy, that's supposed to be kind of a joke. Both and that bookends their relationship. It happens at the beginning, and it happens at what we thought was going to be the end. And you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of the end of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which ends on a similar shared grand fantasy. I don't know if you guys remember how that movie ends. They're about to have the shootout where they die, and they go, you know where we're going to go next? We're going to go to Australia.
Yeah.
And they both know that it's bullshit.
Yeah.
But it's a shared lie of this grand fantasy that they do together. And there's a tragedy in that. And it was like the exact same thing where it's like, we're going to start a jazz band. They both know that's bullshit. They both know it's a joke. And that was one of the most heartbreaking moments for me. It was so subtle, but it was another one of those driving the knife in, of where it's like, this was all bullshit. It was all just for yucks. And you know, it didn't really mean anything. Such that it shouldn't be taken seriously. I'm not going to take this moment seriously. We both know this might be the last moment we see each other, and we're not going to take it seriously. And so it was so subtle. So I guess we're just riffing off what you were saying, Sarah, is that there were tons of these little moments all in that same 10-minute slot at that part of the movie, that were sort of all doing the same thing, sort of leading us in one direction, tying in with the theme and title of the movie, so that when it went off in the other direction at the very, very end, it felt amazing. They keep suggesting that they might offer a reinterpretation of everything that's come before. So it keeps going like, you know, this is the final word on everything that's come before. And then it goes, oh no, this is the final word on that. And that causes you to reinterpret everything you just saw. Oh, this is actually what everything meant.
And then you don't get to hear the final word.
Yes, that's right. But we know what it meant.
Yes.
So it's like you don't get to hear this final word, but you do finally get a conclusion to what did all of the things that we just watched mean.
I know, but I feel like that's like another like broken rule or something. Because even when she gives you what she wants, she doesn't give it to you.
Yes.
Yeah. I thought that was a really genius final touch on the theme of the movie. It's that like, you know, throughout the movie, and this is kind of, all right, I'm actually kind of stealing this because I realize this is something that Erik, you mentioned very briefly earlier. Do you want to talk about how throughout the movie, like they are constantly dealing with this language problem where they're on the outside and they can't understand anything, and then how that last moment intersects with that?
Sure. So obviously the title of the movie is Lost in Translation, and they pay off the meaning of the title of the movie almost immediately. When Bill Murray is in the commercial shoot And then the Japanese director like goes on some like 45-second speech about what he wants him to do. And then the translator just says, he wants you to turn and look into the camera. Bob Harris, he's just like, is that all? Is that really all that was said? And so, Cody, you speak a little Japanese, so you could understand a little bit of what was being said. What was he saying?
It was mostly just like, I mean, to be fair, it actually, she did get the essence of it, because most of what he was saying was just like, come on, you have to feel it. Just like really do it, really look and turn and really come on. Like it was just kind of emphatic, empty language like that.
Gotcha.
Oh.
Sure. So you almost think that scene is why the movie is named what it is, Lost in Translation.
That and so many others.
That's right, because there are a lot of other scenes where they feel like, I feel like there was more that was said to me than just what was translated. So they set that up, and it comes back a few other times in the movie. But it turns out that they planted that scene in the first part of the movie, so that way the mystery at the end would feel good on a storytelling level, because it's almost like, because they're speaking English, so it's not going to be literally lost in translation, but for these two characters that have been so alone in their relationships, and they finally find each other, and we get to share in their sense of shared isolation, they finally get to have one moment at the end that's just like, that's not for us, that's just for them.
Yeah, they're finally on the inside.
They're finally on the inside, and we're the ones that are left behind. So, like Cody and I, we always talk about on this podcast the idea of setting things up so that way when you call them back later, they feel really good. And that final scene where Bob Harris whispers in Charlotte's ear feels good, and not just like something that randomly happens, because they planted those scenes earlier in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
I did try to cheat, and I looked in the script to see if she wrote something for Bill Murray to say in that moment, and she didn't.
I actually looked it up, and there's a YouTube video where they do they do some audio forensics and amplify the volume and do some enhancing technical bullshit. And we know what he said.
Ooh, reveal it.
It was something to the effect of, I can't quote it exactly from memory, but it was something to the effect of, promise me next time you see him, you'll tell him the truth.
Oh. What?
And even that's kind of vague. I mean, not so vague, because I have an instinctive understanding of what that means.
Yeah, he's giving her permission to be herself. Well, that's my interpretation of it.
Yeah, with her husband, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because at the very least, I mean, he's doing her a huge favor by saying that, because it's like, even if we can't be together, which he very much wants, you at least owe it to yourself to not feel trapped. Because she tries to be honest with him, and he just blows her off every time. And it's just like, if this is not working, then tell him the truth about it.
Yeah. Yep. I have the same question she has. Like, how did those two end up together? Who did she marry?
Is there anything else that's worth talking about on structure, on the point of structure?
Yeah. So one of my notes that I wrote about is, and I didn't actually keep track of this because I didn't notice this until about halfway through the movie, but it really felt like they were juxtaposing scenes that were about plot with just those vignettes that were about isolation, that didn't so much move the plot forward, but just filled you with this feeling. So it'd be like, here's a scene that advances the plot, here's a scene of isolation, plot, isolation, plot, isolation. And like I said, I didn't map it out to make sure this was like 100% true, but it very much felt like this was the case throughout the movie. Because my main feeling when I was watching was, I was shocked at how loose and unpolished this film felt, while obviously being neither of those things. It had such a free, blossoming feeling to it that felt effortless, though in hindsight, you can tell that a lot of the reasons these moments in the final act felt good were because of things that were set up in the first hour or so.
Yeah, you're totally right. That was definitely something that they were doing at the beginning. I mean, with the exception of that sort of unique extended beginning, with those mood scenes interspersed and the multiple false endings at the end, with those two exceptions, it was largely like a rom-com plot. I mean, it was right. I mean, the structure, it was like meet cute, bond, have adventures together, then it does, something kind of doesn't quite work, and they go their separate ways and they sleep with somebody else, and then there's the final coming together at the end, which is just like classic rom-com structure. So it's interesting that with I often marvel at how much the difference between like a good movie and a bad movie is like, sometimes it feels so small.
Yes.
It could have been a crappy rom-com, but with a couple genius choices.
There were a couple of moments where I was like, what? When we're speaking about like cheesy rom-com, like running into each other the third time they speak, she's like, you want to come out later? And he's like, sure. And then the next thing we know, he arrives at her door, and I couldn't help myself as like, I have viewed a number of cheesy rom-coms, and I was like, how did he get her room number?
Right.
Right. They don't know each other.
Right.
I don't know if that's a petty thought, or if anybody watching the movie would be like, wait a second, I don't understand this. Are we just supposed to go along with this?
Well, there's almost like this thing that happens where when your hand is so deft and you make so many good choices and you firmly cement the story that's being told in the realm of subtlety and deft storytelling, it's almost like when there are those little moments that almost feel like you could interpret them as slipping back into the realm of cheesiness or slipping back into the realm of cliche. It almost comes all the way around, and it almost becomes like a charming moment. Like in a bad movie, I would absolutely interpret that moment as like, this is moving too fast, I don't buy it. But in this movie, with these characters, it's like, oh, there's Bob being charming again,
Yeah, I just went with it.
It's like if you hit enough in a row, if you do make enough good choices in a row, when the 11th choice is weird, people go with it.
Yep. There are no rules. That was my big takeaway from this movie.
Yeah. I realized that this movie is one of the only movies that does something that I often find myself trying to do in my writing, which is I feel like I'm often trying to not portray characters against characters or equal minds having, discourse or whatever. I often find myself trying to portray, one lone mind against a mass of people, that many of the other characters aren't supposed to be perceived as individuals. They're supposed to be perceived as this one giant collective mass. And that's the character's experience. They feel like that these aren't individuals. And that this movie does, it's a really hard thing to do. And this movie does that. It's like, with the exception of the two main characters, of course, all the other characters, like, you don't know their names. It doesn't matter. They are one inane blob.
Yeah.
And I didn't really have a point there.
So do you think that added to the feeling of isolation?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a hard thing to do because it's difficult to show an absence. So like a lot of times, what that is trying to do is it's trying to show that it doesn't feel like these are individuals. That's an absence. That's not a presence. How do you show when something isn't there? I'm not getting the feeling that you're an individual while I'm talking to you. How do you show that? A lack of a feeling, That's really difficult. So what you have to do is you have to show a lot of interactions back to back to back so that you can start to get a gestalt impression. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what this ties into what I was talking about earlier with the repetition, where it's doing the same thing over and over and over again. The hospital scene that we talked about is just another example. That's another example of a scene showing us they can't understand the people, they can't connect with them, but they connect with each other. They're able to bond over humor, da 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 da. And when you are able to do that over and over and over again, you get this gestalt impression that you can't get with just one interaction. It means that you attribute what the experience is not just to an individual, but you attribute them to an entire milieu. That like the problem is not just her husband, it's everybody. It's people, it's society, it's this bigger concept. And so I guess what I'm driving at is that I guess I'm going back to the repetition point, which is just that like there is a quality to quantity, which of course is not a quote that I have coined, but when you do something over and over and over again, the experience of it can be, if you do it right, that you get this. You don't perceive it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You perceive it as, this bigger thing of like 10 or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, when something repeats, it automatically has meaning to our minds.
Yeah. Can we just talk about that hospital scene for another minute?
Yeah.
The ridiculousness of the whole, like, there's so many things accomplished in that scene because he's goofy for the first time, like super, super goofy. And he's taking care of her. And he gives her a gift that my interpretation is that he bought it for one of his kids. He gives her this ridiculous stuffed animal. And then the next shot is a close-up on the stuffed animal tucked under her arm as they're walking together. And he becomes like a father figure to her in that moment, which is ultimately how it plays out. And I didn't really realize that until we talked about it after.
Yeah, and to bolster, that actually leads into the final thing I wanted to say, because I think the very next scene is a scene we've danced around it, but we haven't dived into it yet. It's where they're watching the movie. I believe the movie is La Dolce Vita, which I think is supposed to parallel their adventures in Japan, because I think I've seen La Dolce Vita, and it's about... It's similar in that it's like a bunch of vignettes of this writer going around Rome, I believe it is, or I don't remember what city in Italy it is. So I think that was an intentional parallel there. And that's the first time where I think this is the scene that's supposed to pay off Charlotte's search for meaning that I brought up earlier, because I think this is the first truly introspective, openly introspective scene in the movie, where they're just lying in bed next to each other, and this is when they're reminiscing about when they first saw each other. He noticed her before she noticed him, like you mentioned, Sarah. And then that's when she talks about how her path is vague, and she asks him about his family and his kids, and that's when he says the line, "The more you know who you are and what you want, the less things upset you," which, as I've said, is not a particularly profound line, but I think she's just grateful for the fact that someone is finally taking her search for meaning seriously and not dismissing it as dark and cynical.
Yeah, but he does say, it's okay to be mean.
He does say that, that's right. He gives her permission, and this is also the scene that ends with the loving foot tap at the end of it.
Yep.
And like I said, I don't remember what he says to her, but I remember the foot tap. So I think that was the climax of Charlotte's search for meaning, and she finally found it with him. And I think that's why she sends him the fax for the restaurant, the lunch. And that's why I was filled with such hope, because it's like, oh my God, they just had this really profound, meaningful scene together.
And they both fell asleep.
It's going back to their insomnia. It was another time where they both were able to find peace and break their insomnia. Then he has sex with the lounge singer.
Can we talk about the scene in the elevator also?
Yeah.
Because I feel like there was something lost between them in the translation of their own body language and their own kind of expectations of what was going to happen next.
You mean the scene where they first gaze at each other in the elevator?
No. I mean the scene when they're going up in the elevator after the after there's been like the fire drill, and they're outside, then they go into the bar, and then they ride up in the elevator together, and we're all expecting something different than what happens. So when they're riding up in the elevator and they've got their robes on because they've been in the fire drill, they had that awkward lunch earlier in the day because she was upset that he slept with someone else, and they're riding up together in the elevator, and the door opens and he goes to get out, and then he gives her a quick kiss, and then the door shuts and they ride up to her floor, and then the door opens and he gives her a quick kiss and she steps out of the elevator. That is not what anyone expected to happen.
Right.
And the lack of understanding of each other, of that moment, is so beautifully awkward.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Yeah, there's I mean, to me, that's a kind of another one of those false endings that we were kind of talking about. It's like she's like setting this up. Like, you think that like, oh, this is it. This is the moment that like they're gonna sleep together or whatever, and it's finally gonna culminate. And then it just kind of fizzles.
I have here in my notes that she explicitly asks Bob Harris to stay with her.
Oh.
And it's almost like in that moment, he rejects that.
That doesn't happen in the elevator. Where does that happen? He says, I don't want to. It's at the bar just before the elevator scene. They come in from the fire drill, and they're sitting at the bar, and he says, I don't want to leave.
Man, that's another. I thought there were 3 false endings. That's a 4th false ending. They did it 4 times. Oh my God, man.
Yeah, and she says, and I think those may be the only 2 lines of dialogue in that scene. I could be wrong about that. But there's almost no dialogue in that scene. But he says that he wants to stay in Japan, which is such a huge thing to say.
Right, and the thing that I remember that moment now, because it was so devastating that the lunch that they had planned, and this is me still having the interpretation that fax that Charlotte sent to him was telling him the location and telling him to meet her there. It was filled with such promise, and then they dropped the ball at the lunch. And then it felt like after the fire alarm was pulled and she said that she wanted him to stay with her, that they had made up. And it's like, okay, the hope has been revitalized, and then it just gets shut down again.
Yeah.
Right there. I remember having that feeling. I was like, oh no, she's messing with me. She's messing with me. And that's why that final moment when, after the 2 other false endings, when he calls her asking for the jacket back, and then the next morning when a fan comes up to him and she's like, oh my God, I know you. And he just totally blows her off to go to Charlotte with the jacket. And then that's another failed moment. And then finally he chases her down. That's what made that so satisfying. And they finally gave me the moment after 4 tries. And, it just felt so good. Oh my God. You can tell from the very beginning of the movie that Charlotte is very motivated by meaning. You know this from her going to the Buddhist temple and trying to find meaning there and not getting it. She listens to these Find Your Path self-help tapes and tries to get it there, but I think that also fails. Cody, we were talking earlier about how this film really makes you feel status and like where people are in the status hierarchy. And you really get that sense when you contrast Charlotte with the film actress who's played by Anna Faris, whose name I'm not remembering. And there's a moment where Charlotte listens to this actress talking about something she did with Keanu Reeves, and she's just being so effing intolerable and boring that it's almost like it's like you see Charlotte try to enter her husband's world because her husband and the actress were really getting along swimmingly. And so she gives it a chance, but she just can't do it. And so then she goes and attends a flower arranging ceremony. So this whole film, she's trying to find meaning, and she gets it in slivers throughout the movie with Bob Harris, but it's only at the very end when they have this shared whispered moment. It's the first time she has any sort of extreme emotional reaction to anything. where she literally weeps at what he says. I think that was an intentional choice, that's the only time in the movie where she does that. And so she's not moved by the profound religious ritual or the flower arranging or any of these traditional Japanese ceremonies that have been imbued with meaning over thousands of years, but she's moved a lot by what he said to her for 5 seconds, which is another way that final scene was really a fantastic payoff.
Well, it's pretty powerful that what he says is tell the truth.
Yes. I'm not sure there's anything more powerful he could have said, because here's my guess. I bet a lot of people think that he whispered to her something expressing his love for her. Because does he ever say "I love you"?
No, that would be way too on the nose.
No, I know.
He does when he says, "I don't want to leave."
Yes, he says that 1 degree removed. But if I had to guess, I'd be willing to bet a lot of people think that's what he whispered to her. But tell the truth and be yourself. What a liberating thing to say that she's not getting from anyone else in the whole movie. Yeah, amazing.
The Insomnia is another great example of, something we talk a lot, but it's just another great example of an objective correlative. It's another great example of an externalization that shows an internal process. So it's it's an easy visual motif that we can track that represents their inner turmoil and their inner strife. And this movie is filled with those, as most great movies are. You don't need that. That's not the point. The point is not can they sleep. The point is do they feel connected or alienated. But it's just a thing that helps us track that. And that's just really powerful. It helps it to really land emotionally.
You know what I forgot to say? I think this is a key moment where this is in their first conversation. This is in Bob Harris's and Charlotte's first conversation. Because remember, in one of the first scenes with Charlotte and her husband, he gets annoyed that she's smoking. And that's another thing that adds to this, man, you're just too heavy. And he doesn't really want to deal with her. But in that first scene, when she's talking to Bob Harris, he doesn't care if she smokes. And I think there are a lot of moments like that where other people have problems with what she's saying. She's too dark. And that's where what you said, Sarah, when he gives her comfort by saying it's okay to be mean. So it's no, you're right and they're wrong. They're gaslighting you. And bringing it back to the point you made, Sarah, he really does become a father figure to her across the course of this movie. But then obviously it has this romantic undertone. Yeah. It's just a masterclass in the evolution of a relationship over time. And I think that's why it's going to be remembered as one of the classics of the 2000s.
Yeah, so I think maybe if we were to try to derive a principle, it's you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Start with a structure that works and add a few peculiarities, add a few things that are a little bit different, and that can be enough a lot of the time. Not that obviously those are the only thing this movie was doing. It was doing a lot of genius things, but just on a structural level, mostly normal, with a couple interesting, great choices.
Yeah, story structure is pretty immutable. It's one of those things where if you stray too far from it, the movie tends to not have meaning to our human brains. It tends to just appear as nonsense. So
yeah, it's you can't reinvent the wheel on a structural level. You have to find magic on. You can do a couple weird things. You can do a couple weird things, do a couple things that are off the beaten path, and then really the magic happens on the micro scale, in the dialogue, in the moment to moment. So maybe we can go into that, because one of the things I really wanted to talk about this. So let's pivot now. We'll kind of move off the topic of structure. One of the things I really wanted to talk about was this movie is a masterclass in subtlety. And subtlety is something that I think is so difficult to pull off just right for a number of different reasons. There's a Scylla and Charybdis on either side. And if you go too far in either direction, it doesn't work. It's this narrow tightrope that you have to walk. If you go too subtle, it's inscrutable and you can't understand it. And if you don't go subtle enough, it feels cheesy and goofy. And in each individual moment, there are a number of issues that can happen. So like, for example, this movie hinges on the idea that the characters feel alienated from the people in their life, but they find, solace in each other. And in order to have that happen, you have to establish that the characters are alienated from the people in their life. And so like, for example, the scenes with Charlotte and her husband that show that she is feeling alienated from him, it can be really easy to have her come across as the bad person, as the bad guy. At one point, they have an interaction with another actress, and afterwards she points out a mistake that the actress made, and he goes, "Not all of us can go to Yale," and it's really easy to have that moment be like, our interpretation is that like, oh, she's a stuck-up elitist, asshole, and she's at fault. Or if you go too far in the other direction, it can too easily be that like, that her husband and the people in his world are cardboard cutouts and they're not believable. They're straw men. And it's like, oh, this is stupid. Like, come on, you're hitting us over the head with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think there were moments that weren't subtle, like at the table in the bar,
Sure.
when the actress just, she's so shallow and so irritating. It's a sledgehammer of irritation.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, but I think those moments probably stand out more because of the restraint that's shown in the rest of the film.
Yeah, I mean, one example of this to me was how, and something I thought was really interesting choice, and I'm not even sure how intentional it was, how I almost felt like their relationship, the main relationship, I mean, between Bob and Charlotte, was very, for lack of a better way of saying it, devoid of content. There wasn't a lot of content there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like we are told through the storytelling that they feel alienated from their spouses, and that they are able to connect with each other. But beyond just having a similar sense of humor, we're not really shown why they connect with each other. It's just kind of like a given. It's just like they just enjoy each other's company.
Yeah, because one of the things I noticed about this movie, which is different from most of the other great movies we've talked about, there are really no standout lines. Like, if you asked me to quote a famous line from this movie, I mean, I took notes, so I wrote down some of the quotes word for word, but if you just asked me to do that off the cuff, I wouldn't be able to do it. All the dialogue, moment to moment, seemed very unremarkable and frankly banal, but the fact that it was sparking this connection between the two characters, like, that was enough. I mean, think of where they started, where Bob Ross
Harris is the painter.
Bob Ross is the painter. Oh my God. I knew I would do that. Okay. Think of where they start at the beginning of this movie. Bob Harris is getting a slew of passive-aggressive faxes from his wife from home. And then perhaps this was one of the most profound moments in the movie for me. It was when Charlotte visited a Buddhist temple and she witnesses a profound religious ceremony. And she goes back and tells her husband, I didn't feel anything when this happened. And
Whoa,
he just...
This is what's interesting. She doesn't tell her husband. She tells her friend on the phone.
Oh, does she? And yeah, and the friend acts very blasé about it too, though, right?
Yes.
Like, is like not invested at all.
But she also says the line, I don't know who I married. And her friend drives right over it.
Yes. So it's like she can find solace nowhere. That's a great point. Because I think we've already seen her interactions with the husband where he's very aloof and career focused. And then, yeah, she probably called the friend because he's like, I'm not going to get anything out of my husband. And the friend is giving her nothing either. So it's like, where can she go? And she can't even get meaning from profound ancient ceremonies that have had meaning for people over many centuries. So she is so lost, and it's only by accident, like a shared insomnia, that she meets Bob Harris in the lounge. I think they're both seeing the lounge singer perform. So that's where they start the movie. And then there's no moment where their dialogue rises above trite banalities. Like, I think one of the lines that was supposed to be the line of the movie was they're on the bed and at a distance, and Charlotte is turned towards Bob Harris, and she's just asking him basic questions about the type of things you learn as you age. And Bob Harris says to her, "The more you know who you are and what you want, the less things upset you." Which, fine advice, but kind of cliche. I didn't feel like that was supposed to be a profound moment. The profound moment in their relationship was, and thinking about where they started, this was all silent. I don't know how they accomplished this. There's a time where she falls asleep, and Bob Harris carries her to the bed, sets her down, and then just like watches her sleep for a moment. And then you see him walking down the hall, and I think that's the first time in the movie that I noticed a genuine smile from Bob Harris's character, all done without dialogue. So it almost felt like the dialogue moments were intentionally trite, and it was the moments that had no dialogue that were supposed to have the hugest emotional impact. Just thinking of the Buddhist temple scene, the scene where Bob Harris carries her to the bed, and then the final a moment when he whispers something that we don't get to hear. All dialogue, all without dialogue. And they're the most profound, in my opinion.
Yeah. I also would add the moment when they're lying on the bed, and right at the end of that moment, he like pats her foot and he says something, and I don't know what he said. But
that's the feeling of the whole movie. It's just like, what did he say? Whatever the line is, it wasn't important. But you remember the foot pat. You remember the foot pat, and that's what the whole movie is like. You remember the things that aren't the words. Like when Cody was talking about the shared fantasy they had about was the fantasy a jailbreak? Cody, what was it, a shootout?
Well, that was the first one. It was jailbreak, and then the last one was jazz band.
Yeah, so let's talk about the first one, the jailbreak, because that fantasy comes true. Remember, where they talk about it, and then they meet up with the Japanese friend who they call Charlie Brown, and he chases them with a BB gun through the streets of Tokyo. So it's almost like that little fantasy came true in some fun way.
That's a good point.
And so it's like I remember that moment as like a charming moment, but I don't remember any of the dialogue that surrounds that moment.
I mean, that had to have been an intentional choice, right? To try to not make the dialogue profound. That's another example of what Sarah said what you said to begin with, Sarah, where you said like they break so many rules. Like,
yeah,
that's so right. Like that's such a risk. That is such a risk because it so runs the risk of of the audience going, what? I don't get it. I don't buy it. Why are they special to each other?
You understand why they might connect. For me, anyway, I understood why they might connect from the very first moment in the elevator. And I actually thought it was brilliant that later she doesn't remember that moment. And it was so impactful for at least me as an audience member. And it was so impactful for him because it's the first time he noticed her. And she doesn't remember it at all.
Why do you think that's significant that she doesn't remember it?
Well, because she's probably not lying. And that's interesting because it says something about the character of a woman who's used to being looked at.
Okay.
And it's not as meaningful for her as it is for him. But also she's disconnected. She's not in the moment as much as he was. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, no, sure.
You know, the other thing that was surprising to me, which is kind of trivial, but it was probably around that 30-minute mark, maybe a little bit later, that I was like, there has been very little dialogue in this film. And I just couldn't help myself after watching it. I had to go and look up how many pages was the script. It's 75 pages.
Yeah, it's very sparse, which is such a risk. It's such a risk to do that, right? Like, you're really banking on the little acting choices and the cinematographic choices and the music choices to make it work.
Yeah.
And it does, of course, which is just like so hard to pull off. So how does she pull it off? How do they pull off making us believe that these characters have a profound connection?
Because they make them so relatable in the first 30 minutes when they're not talking to each other. We know how they feel, the isolation. We are with them. We get it. And so we can totally understand when you are that desperate for a connection, when you think that the lounge singer is awful and you look across and you make eye contact with someone else who also thinks the lounge singer is awful, it's like, oh my God, long lost friend, oasis in the desert.
That's a good point.
Right. And if you guys remember the first moment that they talk, I remember the moment where they first talk, and I wouldn't have remembered what the content was except that I wrote it down. Because Charlotte sits down next to Bob Harris, and she's wondering what she should get to drink. And Bob Harris turns to her and uses that cheesy slogan on her. But it doesn't work. So it's like this power that he's had over people, like his whole life, where like all these fans are coming up to him and they're like adulatory and they listen to him. But she's just like he can't even sell Charlotte on this thing that he's been good at for his whole, like for the last however many years. And it has I don't know if you guys have had this moment in a relationship where it's usually one of the first moments where you realize the person you're talking to is different, because like you have some, I'm not one of those people who has like tricks. I'm very trickless because I'm kind of inept. But some people have like tricks that work in those type of situations. And it sort of makes you cynical that people can like fall for tricks like that. And I think that's what Bob Harris thought, where he's just like, oh, I have this thing that I can use and it'll always work because I'm beloved. It does not work on Charlotte. And at that moment, he immediately realizes she's different. She's different.
Yes, that's a great point both of you are making. It's they share cynicism. They have a shared cynicism. And they recognize that they both reject the inanity. So it's not even necessarily that they have to have substance. It's the rejection of other people's lack of substance is enough.
Yeah.
Because the other thing they talk about in their first conversation is they both fantasize about leaving Japan. And then the rest of their relationship is a playing out of a series of fantasies. The jailbreak fantasy, which comes true with the BB gun. And they share in all these different types of fantasies together, which the very first fantasy is them about leaving, but then by the end they don't want to leave because then that means they can't be together anymore at that time, which by the end of the movie, it's almost like they can't live without each other, but they have to.
So what is the trick to pulling off subtlety? Like I said, it just seems like there's so many ways that it can go wrong. What is the guiding light? What is the lighthouse that you can follow to make these subtle moments land the way that they're supposed to?
Okay, if I had to just lay out in order the ingredients that they use to make these things work, since they did the work in the first act of the movie to give us those little vignettes of isolation, they showed us all of them in painstaking detail, while also adding humor to lighten the mood when possible. They did that work, and then they intentionally dialed the dialogue down to like a 5, where it wasn't particularly bad, like it wasn't badly written dialogue, but it also didn't stand out.
Well, I would argue that some of it really stood out.
Okay.
But in the way that it was passed over. Like I was saying before about the line where she says, I don't know who I married, and her friend's like stuck in another conversation or doing something else on the other end of the line, like can't really deal with her in that moment. And I think that you can be, that as long as you're really honest, you can be very subtle.
Sure, yeah, that's a good point, because there's never a moment between the two of them that's not very honest. And now that you brought that up, Sarah, I'm remembering another moment. Bob Harris has a very similar moment when he's talking to his wife on the phone about the carpet swatches, the burgundy. And an exact quote, he says, "I'm just completely lost." And
Yeah.
I think the meaning of it is totally lost on his wife. So it's like that mirrored, but what's in those scenes are not right next to each other. I think Charlotte's happens near the beginning of the movie, and then Bob Harris's happens almost at like the 2/3 mark. So it's like a mirror image.
I have a rule in my writing for myself, one of many, that says always be more honest than clever.
Yes.
And I think that was definitely on display here. Like there was I never felt, there was a lot of honesty, and I never felt any attempts to be clever. I think that's a big part of like why it works. Like it always feels like it is, it's not trying.
Yes.
And there's an effortlessness that when that happens, that what does it do? It really helps. What it does is, I have a visual metaphor I'm seeing in my head. It's like we have a scale, an emotional scale that we that we map the movie onto. The most intense moments of the movie get mapped to a 10, and the least intense moments get mapped to a 0. And when you have a really, really intense moment in a movie that is obviously over the top intense, that's your 10. And then in comparison, if you have a subtle moment in the movie, that's like a 2 or whatever, and it feels underwhelming. But when the whole movie is just 1s and 2s and 3s, you recalibrate your whole scale.
Yes.
And the 3s become 10s.
Yes. Which is why when Bill Murray has that subtle, honest smile after he drops Charlotte off at her room, that was one of the most profound movies. And it's just a smile. It's just a smile. And I think that's when you say never be more clever than honest, I think that's more what I meant when I said the dialogue was a 5. Not in terms of quality. Yeah, because when most people think of good dialogue, they think of like sassiness and cleverness. But this movie was almost never sassy or clever, which I appreciated.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. If you try to make this movie and also try to be clever, it doesn't work. It immediately blows up. Another thing that I think that made the subtlety work in this movie, because this is just one of the most subtle movies I've ever seen that still works completely, like fully 100%. I've seen subtler movies that don't work as well. Repetition. There's a lot of repetition in this movie. They really don't leave it to chance that you're going to understand what's happening. Like we show it again and again and again. Here's showing you, that's part of what, Erik, you were talking about in the beginning when there's all of those vignettes of isolation. They're showing the same thing in different ways. Here's how they're isolated. Then do it again. Here's another way showing how they're isolated. Here's another way showing how they're isolated. But that's true for everything in the movie. Then when the relationship is being established, we see the same thing over and over. Here's how they bond and how they find solace in each other. Here's another moment of them feeling really close, and it's a little bit different. It's a variation on a theme, but it's the same thing. And that continued repetition, not only is it meditative and it helps to establish the mood, but it also helps so that you really understand the subtle things that are happening and they land.
Right, because there are a few types of repetition. So I'll repeat some things I've said just to make it clear, because there's the repetition of juxtaposing scenes of isolation with plot. Like that gives it a sort of like ebb and flow where it's like isolation, plot, isolation, plot, isolation, plot. So it has a expectation to it that has a groove that you can really get into. And then there's obviously the motif of the passive aggressive fax machine messages that Bob Harris's wife is sending to him. But then another one that we didn't talk about, we did talk about the lounge singer, but I think what was supposed to be the climax of the movie was when on a lark, he decides to sleep with her. And we don't know that until we see he wakes up and she's singing in the shower or whatever. And the only reason that felt good and not like something that just happened is because in the early parts of the movie, they established through repetition, like we see them listen to the loud singer sing once, and not just for like 5 seconds. Like we listened to her sing for like 30 seconds. And then again, a different song for 30 seconds. And so that way, when he finally sleeps with her at that climactic point of the movie, it feels like something's been paid off as opposed to something that just randomly happened. And then obviously that has ramifications for the ending. I don't think the movie could have ended the way it did had he not screwed up and slept with the lounge singer. I think it added more meaning to those scenes where, because if he hadn't slept with the lounge singer, you could have gotten to that ending scene where he whispers in her ear sooner because he didn't fuck up. He would have just been able to have that scene. But because it feels like they're pissed off at each other now a little bit, that it feels like the relationship almost has to start again at the end of the movie.
Yeah, but that's another great example of the subtlety. The scene, the lunch scene, like the big romantic fight.
Yeah, the awkward sushi lunch, as I wrote in my notes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like no fight. It's just a little tense.
There's no fight, but she's kind of like she shows her age. She shows her youth.
She does
in that moment. She's just a little bit catty.
And the thing about that lunch that was particularly painful was, didn't she send him the fax that showed him the location of the lunch? So she built up this hope in him that's like, this is going to be the moment where it's like, okay, all my frustrations are going to pay off. But then he fucks up and sleeps with the lounge singer the night before. So then it's like a coitus interruptus for them. And they have to rekindle it once they have to leave the building because of the fire alarm.
I think you're mixing up the times that she sends him a message and the time that she shows up at the door.
Am I?
Yeah, she invites him to lunch when she shows up that morning and realizes he slept with it. She's like, oh, I was just going to see if you wanted to have lunch.
And she's like, oh, looks like you're busy, though.
Oh. What was that fax message that he sent her where it's like, let me know if you get lost, and she points an arrow on a map of the city? Was that not pointing out the lunch?
Oh, maybe that comes after.
Because I thought what happened? I think he got that fax message because he wanted to leave Japan imminently because it was too much for him. But then she sent him that fax, and he's like, you know what? I will go on the Japanese Johnny Carson show. And he has a little bit of fun on the show. It's kind of goofy to our Western eyes. And then I think that's the night where he can't sleep again. He has insomnia, so he goes to the bar and listens to the lounge singer. Then they sleep together on a lark. And then she shows up as a reminder. It's possible I'm remembering this wrong. And you may be right, Sarah, that they're not connected at all. If they weren't connected, they should be. That's my point.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it does. Sorry. But that's something that's interesting, too, that Coppola does is like he's showing such restraint and respect with Charlotte's character. And then he just goes and sleeps with the lounge singer. You're like, whoa, okay, you people are many layered.
That's right.
I mean, part of what that I think meant was that like it's like the sex is not what makes it profound.
Right.
There's a concept that I think of a lot in stories, especially like visual storytelling, film and TV, where I call it the subtlety hierarchy. And I think it's something we've brought up on this podcast before, which is this idea that there's a hierarchy of subtlety of ways that you can express something. So the least subtle way is through dialogue. If a character has to say like, I am tired, like that is a very unsubtle way. And then there's more subtle ways, like a facial expression is more subtle. And then even more subtle is things like just like a costume design or set design choice that's like very background. My general rule, I feel like that I think is generally correct, is that you want to try to, if you can do something more subtly, you should. You should always try to do things in the most subtle way possible. So if you have to say it with dialogue, fine, do it with dialogue. But if you can do it with a facial expression, that's better. And this movie I'm kind of just repeating earlier themes, so I think I'll put this earlier, but this movie really exemplifies that. And they really didn't need any dialogue. It's almost there as like an aesthetic. Like it doesn't really hold a lot of content, with a couple key moments accepted. Yeah,
it's funny because it's kind of that the scene that you were talking about earlier with the director when the translator comes back and gives him like two words almost of instruction when the director's been talking for quite some time. And it's like, I don't know if this is what she was trying to say, but sometimes more words are useless. Like, you don't need that many words to convey the message.
Right. It's almost a relief when Cody was saying that a lot of it's just like, it's like trying to pump him up. It's like, you can do it. You have it in you. You can do it this way. And she's just like cutting out all the crap. It's just like, okay, here's the real instruction.
Yeah. And he can't accept that. He's like, that's it? Can't be that easy.
Yeah, totally. That's a good point. Let's talk for a second about this, something that was, obviously very definitely an intentional choice, which is something I alluded to briefly earlier, which is how, the title of the movie is lost in translation. It's when you watch the first 10 minutes, you think that it's clearly about, this is about two people who feel culture shock being in a foreign culture, and they feel alienated and isolated by that. And then that's really not the point. It's not that they feel isolated from Japan or by being in Japan. It's that they feel isolated from the people who are supposed to be closest to them in their lives. And Japan is just almost secondary. It doesn't even matter. And well, let me just say one more thing about that, which is just that, and the really drives that point home is that about 2/3 through the movie, they both have moments where they start to connect more with the that their initial isolation and alienation from the Japanese culture starts to dissolve, and they start to feel at least a little bit, not completely, it's not like they become fully integrated or anything, but they start to feel a little bit more kinship with it. But the alienation from their, and so therefore it shows that that was never the point, and that was never the real problem. Those examples, the moments that do that are when Bob Harris is on the phone with his wife, and he says, I really want to start eating healthy like they eat here in Japan. And then, of course, she says some snide thing in response. And then the karaoke was another example of that, where I
had a thought out of left field, which was because you were talking about the very beginning of the film, and the opening shot of the film sets you up to think it's going to be a different kind of movie than it is, and is part of what adds the tension through the romantic comedy side of the film, the whole will they, won't they, because she sets the film up with a shot of a woman's underwear in bed, and you just think it's going to be a completely different movie.
See-through underwear. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks for that distinction, Erik. Yeah, totally. That's a great point. Yeah, and I think that, that's actually totally in line with what I was about to say, which is that I think it's just a powerful technique. Can be, I guess the way I would articulate it is something like, the point is not the point. Mm-hmm. It's like I've seen this technique many times in different stories in different movies, where there's this sort of initial layer that is set up to be, that you think is going to be the point at first, and then that is peeled back throughout the story to reveal this deeper thing that is actually the point.
Sure. To pick up on that with the karaoke scene that you were talking about, this is what I wrote down, but you're making me re-examine this note that I wrote. I thought that the karaoke scene was about them singing songs that articulated their real thoughts, because they're living their lives and they try to be honest with the people around them, but the problem is their honesty is depressing and dark, and other people don't want to hear it. And so I thought that the karaoke scene was them singing songs that showcase their real thoughts. But what you just said, Cody, is making me re-examine it. I think that scene is just supposed to show them having fun, which is, there's very few movies that just bask in the feeling of people having fun. Like maybe the movies will have a montage with some anthem playing in the background, where it's you're running on the amusement park and you're going on all the different rides. I don't know why this movie's popping into my head, but I'm thinking of the Jimmy Neutron movie where they do that, where all the parents are shipped away and they're having fun at the amusement park. But this is a totally different way of just showing these lonely people immersing themselves in this culture that they're not familiar with and just having a blast. I mean, they just had a chase scene with a BB gun, and now they're just living life and singing karaoke. And I wish I was there with them. It looked like they were having so much fun.
Yeah, it was very satisfying. But it was another one of those false leads because, it just added fuel to this is a romantic comedy.
Right. In fact, now that I see where I am in the structure of the movie with my notes, it was after they sang the karaoke, that was the part where immediately afterwards, Bob Harris carries Charlotte back to her room. And yeah, they don't consummate their love in any way. He just carries her there, watches her sleep, and then smiles in the hallway. But that was I felt so delighted by it that's just like, I didn't need anything else. I didn't need a kiss. It was so great.
Okay, I have two more things in my notes here that I wanted to talk about. The next one was, let me introduce this by saying, to me, I think there's this something that Erik and I have talked about a lot, and I think all writers think about a lot, is like cliche. It's like we're always battling against cliche because like there's just been so many stories that have been told and so many movies that have been made, and there's you're constantly like, how do we make this fresh? And I think that the answer to that is the answer to a lot of questions that a writer might ask themselves when they're trying to tell stories. And the answer is, in a word, specificity, I think. And this movie had one of the main things I think that made this movie work on so many different levels is that it was filled with excellent, peculiar specificities that if left in sort of vague generality, it wouldn't have worked. But because it wasn't vague and it wasn't general, it was a concrete, specific, weird thing. It totally worked. So there's tons of examples of this. Off the top of my head, a few of them are the weird hooker moment that we talked about earlier. The burgundy. It's not just that he's not getting along with his wife. It's how is he not getting along with his wife? It's a specific thing that's happening where it shows her character. It shows how they're not connecting. It shows how she cares about these little weird things that he does not think are important, and he cares about other things that she doesn't think are important. Their values aren't connecting. Right, it really lands, and it does it in such a specific and unique way. The faxes are it's one thing to just write a passive aggressive character, but to have that manifest in such a specific way that she sends faxes, which of course has only become more funny over time as faxes have become not a thing. Yeah. Right, it's like so many. It's so specific. It's you can feel it. You can smell the movie. You can like taste it, and those choices make. They just make those moments pop. They rescue the movie from any danger of cliche, and they make how do I say this? They make the subtlety that we've been talking about so much. They make it spicy and they make it dance in a way that maybe without them, it wouldn't be interesting enough because it's so subtle.
Yeah.
Sure. Let's think about this sequence of events that we've talked about, because I'm realizing right now that a lot of these scenes that we keep coming back to, they all happened in a row. And think of how specific they are in capturing the mood that's trying to capture. So they go out with Charlie Brown, and they live their fantasy of the jailbreak with the BB gun chase through the arcade and the streets of Tokyo. Very specific. They bask in the fun with the karaoke scene. Then immediately after that is when Bob Harris carries Charlotte back to the room and has that wonderful smile. And then immediately after that is the phone call with the wife where he says he wants to start eating healthier, and then she says, well, why don't you just live in Japan? Like, that's very specific. And then going back to my point about structure earlier, where it's like they juxtapose plot with isolation. What's the scene immediately after the phone call? He's golfing on a golf course right by Mount Fuji. And like, I don't know if, once again, I don't know if Sofia Coppola was thinking of this, if she thought, okay, now I need a scene of isolation. And she came up with that beautiful moment. Like, think of the specificity of that, where it's like, anyone else, like, they would have been like, oh, what's a cultural landmark in Japan? Mount Fuji. But she thought, golf course alone in front of Mount Fuji. Very specific.
Yeah.
Going back to Cody's point.
Yeah. There was also a subtle moment, or a not so subtle maybe, moment in the scene where he puts her in bed. There, you think she's going to speak to him, you think something's going to happen, and she just falls asleep so quickly and so beautifully. And it's like, oh, they were suffering insomnia up until this point.
Yeah.
It's just a lovely moment because it's not what you expect, and she also gets this relief.
And he gets relief because he sits there and watches her for like 10 seconds in the same way a father would watch their child sleep.
Yeah.
I noted that when I saw it too. Yeah, there's so many of those little things that to track, of these little motifs, these little arcs that are completed. It's like that was a complete arc. She had insomnia, and then she bonded with Bob Harris, and it cured the insomnia. It's like that's its own little arc, and it's all done. No dialogue. It's just a thing that's a little shown, and it's so easy. Like, and there's a ton of those. There's a dozen of those. In the movie.
And him falling asleep in the taxi cab. I'm like, oh, good, he gets some sleep.
Yes.
One of the things that I thought was really funny was the photographer taking his picture, and that his James Bond reference was Roger Moore. And
that's right.
Yeah.
Bob Harris is like, what? I would have gone with Sean Connery. Right?
Yeah. Oh, Japan.
It's so specific.
Yeah. I had this thought when I was watching this movie, and I feel like I stand by it. This movie feels like the nega before Sunrise. You know what I mean? Like, there's so many parallels between these two movies.
Yes.
There's like a lot of them. They both are the relationship between two people that's formed in a foreign place under while traveling, and there's a time constraint on the relationship. Can you make it to the point of profundity before the time constraint runs out?
Right.
It's a charm film, all about the subtle moments but in a way, but it's also like the mirror image, because they don't make it work.
Right.
They're never going to see each other at the end. And I think there's a whole, I mean, we won't have it. We don't need to have it, but I think there's a whole conversation to be had there, just comparing these movies and how they accomplish similar things with similar methods, and also very different things with similar methods.
I would have to watch Before Sunrise again to engage thoughtfully in that conversation.
Sure.
But I would love to.
What do you think about that, Erik? I know that's one of your favorite movies.
Can you, because I know you wanted me to compare the two, so I was crossing off things on my notes that I wanted to make sure I hit everything.
Wow.
I know.
Wow, thank you. Thanks for paying attention when I'm talking. I appreciate it.
Just repeat the first half. Okay. I heard Before Sunrise.
Erik, you're fired. All right. I think you get the point. I mean, it was just that, I think there's a lot of similarities between the two movies. They're doing a lot of the same things, using a lot of the same bag of tricks, but ultimately to very different ends. I mean, despite all of these on-paper similarities between these two movies, they ultimately feel like very different movies. So what do you think about that? Before
I move on, you used the word charm film. Have we ever talked about that on this podcast? We may be introducing it for the first time right now.
It might be the first time. That's your term. Why don't you go ahead and talk about it?
Sure. So I needed to come up with the term charm film because there was this type of movie that I loved that there was no classification for it that was satisfying it to me. Because the two categories of movies that I like tend to fall into epic and then like something more small scale, but like I was trying to think, it's like there's already like the rom-com that has that classification, but it's like that's not the flavor of the movie. But what it is it's the contrast between the feeling of magnitude of big moments, like things that like are history changing moments, and then there's the power of small interpersonal moments. And so I classified those two ends of the spectrum as like epic films, and then I came up with the term charm films, because the magic of small interpersonal moments is just really like charming. It's kind of a dumb little term, but I'm sticking with it.
No, it does what it says on the tin. It makes sense.
Sure. So
would if I was to like, would Amelie fit into the category of charm film? Okay.
Yes, you got it. You nailed it. So yeah, Amelie. Pretty much all of Richard Linklater's films would fall into this category. I think this movie falls into that category. So Cody brought up the movie Before Sunrise, which is that trilogy, Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, Before Midnight, one of the great trilogies in film. And maybe soon to be what's it called when there's four? It's not a trilogy, it's a tetralogy. I think that's still three. Dang it.
Yeah, series.
That's right. I don't frickin' know words. So anyways, so here's one main difference between Before Sunrise and Lost in Translation. In Before Sunrise, I felt like the dialogue was more intentionally clever.
Yes.
Never to the point of being like Joss Whedon-y, where it's very like crafted and sassy and people having good comebacks, but I was more engrossed in the dialogue of the Before movies than I was in this movie. And it was almost like in Before Sunset, it almost feels like there's a constant stream of dialogue. There's never a moment where it just lets you breathe in a moment until maybe the very end of that first movie in the trilogy. Whereas this movie does the opposite. It's almost all breathing in moments with very little notable dialogue, while still being good dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's totally true. I remember watching Before Sunset, and the first time I watched it, I finished the film and went back to the beginning just to check, was that one conversation? And then I ended up watching the whole film all the way through again in that setting, because I was like, wow, that was just one conversation. It was dialogue driven.
Yes. So I feel like the Before films are long, clever conversations that are leading up to like maybe one or two moments that are notable for their absence of dialogue, where they just bask in the love. Like that second movie in the trilogy you just talked about, Before Sunset. Yeah, it's all one conversation leading up to that last moment where he just sits there and watches her dance. And I don't want to say any more about it because, like, as Cody knows, that's one of my favorite moments in like film history. So we should really dedicate a whole podcast episode to those movies. I won't want to talk about it here. Whereas this movie, it was like it gave you that last moment in Before Sunset throughout the whole movie. It was always paying you off with those types of moments, but the dialogue never. The dialogue's not the point of Lost in Translation. I could confidently say.
I think that is accurate.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the big differences between them. And it's just interesting, like, they can both work. Like, tons of dialogue, no dialogue. It's like if you just pick a thing and commit to it really hard.
And the thing that they picked in both movies, just to bring it back to that thing you said, Cody, is they were both honest. They were both true expressions of what they were trying to do. Because even though there was a lot of dialogue and highly clever dialogue in the Before movies, it never felt like it strayed away from the characters, and it never felt like it was too writery. You know what I mean? There are a lot of screenwriters that are writery, like Joss Whedon, Quentin Tarantino, Aaron Sorkin. Their dialogue feels very writery, and that can be fine if that's the thing you're trying to do. But that is not what Richard Linklater is trying to do in the Before movies. That is not what Sofia Coppola is doing in Lost in Translation. And it worked.
Yeah, that might be one of the things that makes them feel like they have a lot in common, is that I believe there was a lot of improvisation in both films. And what I thought was so fascinating about Lost in Translation is the amount of information you get about Bill Murray's character in 3 incredibly quick moments. Like, you know he's somebody important. You know he has an estranged relationship with his wife because of simple facts. And then you learn that he's not necessarily washed up, but a beloved actor who hasn't been working for a while at the bar with those 2 guys so quickly. Hey, aren't you, it's like, oh, they recognize him because he's an actor.
That's right. And not only that, but he's bored by all of it. He's bored by seeing himself in that advertisement in a foreign country. If you see an advertisement of yourself in a foreign country, that means things are either going really well for you or really badly. Like, you're either worldwide famous, or it's like you can't make it in America, so you have to get famous in other places first.
Right. Or you're a wanted terrorist.
And same thing with Charlotte, where same thing. We learn so much about her in just a few scenes where she visits the Buddhist, or she wakes up next to her husband, and I think, is she trying to be sort of like lovey-dovey towards him, and he's like rolling over and trying to reject that?
Well, he's very clearly sleeping, and she says, "Are you awake?" Because she's so lonely.
Right, and she's suffering from insomnia, like you said.
Yeah. And then he gives her a hug, and it looks like a cozy moment. Like, I remember thinking, "Oh, that looks so comfortable and cozy," and then I realized she was just still wide awake. She was not comfortable.
Right, and then there's that. You can tell that she's a seeker, both because of the Buddhist temple scenes, but then she's also listening to those tapes about like, finding your purpose.
Well, we've hit on all of the points that I have written down. Did you guys have anything else?
There's so many stories where they think they're clever for like not giving you what they want, and then they call it a twist, and they think they're geniuses. I'm really not a fan of that. I'm not a fan of intentionally leaving your audience unsatisfied at the end of the movie. Because throughout the movie, if you build something up and then destroy it and leave your audience unsatisfied within the course of the movie, that can be very effective. But if you leave your audience unsatisfied at the very end of a movie, you're a con artist. You're just a total grifter. And it's like, what are you doing? And yes, J.J. Abrams, I'm talking to you. So I know you're listening. I'm talking to you.
Oh.
We don't like J.J. Abrams on this podcast.
Oh no.
So, sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry if we sucked you into this. You can apologize on your own behalf and save yourself if you want to.
Sarah, you're complicit now.
I mean, we interviewed him recently for a project I'm currently working on that I can't talk about, and I really
Cody, cut this out.
JJ, if you're listening, Sarah totally agrees with us, and she hates you too. No, I'm just kidding.
No, but I've been surprised recently to learn how many people are not big fans.
I think it's mostly because of Lost and the recent Star Wars movies that people feel that way.
Yeah. Well, just as a side note, can I tell you my favorite quote from our J.J. Abrams interview, if I can find it?
Yeah. By the way, I wanted to ask you, where are these interviews going to be? Because I want to listen to them.
Yeah, Robert Zemeckis. I want to hear what you said to him. I love his movies.
Yes, I do too. I can't tell you on this podcast.
Okay.
Fair enough.
Oh yeah, I know where it is. Here it is. It's so cute. He's talking about perspective and what he says. There are problems, and then there are movie problems. And whenever I have a movie problem, I think the healthiest thing for me, at least, is to feel that thing and then remind myself it's an effing movie problem. And the fact that I have a movie problem, like if you told me when I was 10 years old seeing Star Wars that I'd be lucky enough in my life to ever have one movie problem, I would have been like, what? I'm gonna get to have movie problems? Like, give me a movie problem any day. I just thought that was really cute.
Sure, yeah, that's great. I have the same thought often. It's totally, I mean, not on the same scale, but sure, yeah. To recap, what are the principles that we can take from this movie? What does this movie You know, if we had to just sum it up, what we can learn from this movie.
Sure.
Well, be honest. Not just the message of the film, but looking at the dialogue. Be specific and be honest.
Yes. Be specific and honest, and you can make a movie feel uncrafted by using this technique where she juxtaposes scenes about plot with one-off vignettes about isolation, which led to the free-flowing quality of the movie. And that repetition gave meaning to things that, because it's very easy if you're trying to write an uncrafted movie for it to feel rambly, and it just never is on track. But this movie never feels that way. And I feel it's because of that juxtaposition of those things.
Yeah, I would say also be efficient. She's so efficient in the character development. Everything happens so quickly, but you get an enormous amount of information very quickly.
I would also say, don't be afraid to bask in just moods. Just be willing to sit in a mood.
Yeah.
Just have Bill Murray sit and watch Scarlett Johansson sleep for a little while. It's okay to spend 15 seconds doing that. It's okay.
Yeah, the reality is we all love people watching. We don't always need them to be talking to us.
Yeah, I think one big one would be something like, and I think that this is, again, kind of ties into our brief discussion about Before Sunrise, which is that like and ties into what Sarah sort of opened the whole thing by saying, which was that this breaks so many rules. It's like the methodology that you're using doesn't matter. You can have a lot of dialogue, you can have minimal dialogue. You can make it really moody, you can make it really this, you can make it funny, you can make it serious. Like that doesn't matter as long as you do two things. Number one, follow storytelling principles, set up and call back, plant things and call them back, make sure that you are showing the arcs of the characters, et cetera, and B, recognize the downfall or the downsides or the deficits, or what's the word I want to use, the weak suits of the methodology or the medium that you're using, and correct for it. So like, the downside or the dip or the danger, maybe that's a better word to use. The danger of using too much dialogue is that it can feel writery, like you were talking about, Erik. So you need to correct for that. You need to keep that in mind. You need to take that into account and make sure that you try to be really honest with your dialogue and not make it too goofy, too, on the nose and cheesy. The downside or the danger of using really minimal dialogue is that things can be too subtle and they might not land. How does she correct for that? She has lots of repetition that makes sure that the points land. So it's like, recognize where the thing that you're using might go wrong and correct for that. And then not only will that avoid that downfall, but it will also naturally help to result in the unique thing it will result in the thing that makes your movie unique. So it's like, if you just follow that line of thinking, if you just go, well, I want this to be a very moody dialogue minimum movie. What if that means that it'll be so subtle that people won't get it? Well, we'll make sure that we have lots of repetition to solve that problem. Suddenly, that it becomes a whole new thing, and it creates the whole mood for the movie. And it becomes the unique thing that generates what the movie is and the identity of the movie.
And the specificity that you were talking about. The specificity and the repetition of that specificity.
Yes, I mean that too. Yeah, specificity is also a really important thing that I think is separate from that point I was just making, but is also super important. So many storytelling problems can be solved with more specificity. Like I feel like that. It's just like all the time. I'm just like, how could that problem be solved? More specific. Get more specific.
And then just to highlight, because you were talking about the setup and callback, the specific setup and callbacks in this movie are, they set up the lounge singer, they show her singing twice, so that way it feels like it's paid off when he sleeps with her, and that climactic part of the movie. And then there's also the setup where the Japanese film director is going on that long tangent, and then she boils it down to the basic parts, which confuses Bob Harris, and that makes the ending where we, the audience, are lost in translation when he whispers to her at the end. That makes that feel like a huge payoff, an even bigger payoff than it already feels like, just out of the pure emotional release of that moment.
Can I ask you guys a question based on this concept of breaking the rules? Like, it's been beaten into my head, there must be an inciting incident. What do you think the inciting incident was in this film? Or was there one?
Great question.
Well, it was their meeting. I mean, if you had to identify one, it would be just them meeting, right?
In the elevator? Or
at the bar.
Yeah, I think the bar, because he sees her in the elevator for the first time, and then she sees him in the lounge, and she sends him over that gift, but he leaves before he either leaves before he gets it, or he leaves before he realizes who sent it to him. And it's only when she sits down next to him and he tries to sell her on the whiskey and she orders something else, and then he gives her permission to smoke, that all of a sudden both of them are like, he's like, whoa, she's not starstruck by me, she's not falling for my shtick. And then she's like, he's letting me be myself because I can smoke around him. And that's when they start to have their mutual fantasies, and we're off.
Yeah, I mean, all the inciting incident is, right? I mean, it doesn't, the point of the inciting incident is simply that it's just the thing that begins the drama, right? It's just in other words, it's the thing that is different from what has come before. Every story starts and you're in the, what Joseph Campbell would call the ordinary world. Things are normal. Things are as they've always been. And then something happens and they're no longer normal. So in this movie, the thing that is no longer normal that we have to adapt to is they meet each other.
I see.
Right? I mean...
Yeah, it's just such an unusual film in that you spend so much time getting to know them before they meet each other.
Yeah.
Sure. And that is a thing that I have seen before. I mean, in fact, just the last episode we did was we spent a long time talking about how we talked about Man on Fire, and the inciting incident in that movie is the kidnapping of PETA, and that happens like an hour into the movie.
Ah. Okay, I'll have to check that film out.
Rocky is another example of that. Rocky takes like a really long ass time before boxing is even like comes up at all. Just getting to know the characters. So I think it has been done, but
No, I'm sure. Because I've recently been watching a lot of old movies where the inciting incident happens in like the first 5 minutes.
Sure. Yeah, don't be afraid to bask. Don't listen to people who give you page counts of when things need to happen. I think that's a good rule.
Exactly.
I'm so tired of people saying it's like, oh, the inciting incident should happen by page 15 or whatever page it needs to be. Just be an artist. Use your dramatic instincts.
That's my big takeaway from this film.
Yeah. Storytelling is not a craft; it's an art. So the point that you always have to be thinking about is like, what are we trying to do here? And what is the best way of doing that? And maybe it's by following old tried and true rules, and maybe it's not. And oftentimes it's not. And it's like, where the rules work for you, great, follow them. Where they don't work, discard them. As long as you know what you're doing. I mean, the problem, it's like jazz, right? It's like, it's the classic thing where it's like what that famous Miles Davis quote is like, learn as much music theory as you can and then immediately forget all of it. And it's like, well, what the hell is that quote supposed to mean? What he's trying to say in jazz cat language is he's trying to say that like the theory is not the end, it's the means. You are trying to accomplish something artistically, emotionally, and the theory is just the tools by which you do that. But no tool set is ever complete. You never have this. There's no toolbox in the world that has every tool in it. So you're always going to eventually be at a point where if you're only willing to look inside the toolbox you have or that's been given to you, you're not going to have the right tool. You have to always be willing to invent a new tool or look inside a different toolbox to find the thing that you need to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
And the risk with that is being inscrutable. The risk with that is that you do something that is unrecognizable to the audience and they can't understand it. And so you just have to know that that's the risk that you're running and correct for that via however you need to do that.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
All right. So that seems like maybe a good place to end it. Sarah, I mean, is there anything that you want to mention your projects?
Well, it hasn't been announced yet, but I did a series on Netflix called Heist, which will be coming out in July.
What's that about? Do you want to give us a quick elevator pitch?
Yeah, it's documentaries with recreations. It's basically the stories of real life heists with the people who pulled them off and the people who caught them or didn't, as the case may be.
Cool.
Yeah, it's 3 separate stories, each 2 episodes long, so it's a 6-episode first season.
Wow.
Very cool. And you're working on a game with, you're working on a video game with the Dalai Lama, right?
No. No, but working with the Dalai Lama's team at Emory University, who created the curriculum for social, ethical, and emotional learning. I mean,
because the image I had is just you and the
Dalai Lama,
and the Dalai Lama is just like in a basement. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is not what's happening. But it does turn out that Brendan, the man who wrote the curriculum, is an avid gamer. And the first conversation we had with the Dalai Lama's representative in the U.S. and this man who wrote the curriculum, his representative is probably in his 70s and was a monk, and we're having this conversation about video games, and he's like, when I was a child, my games were sticks and stones, so I will leave this to Brendan. It's very cute. Yeah, it's a game, it's a fantasy RPG to encourage empathy, compassion, and awareness, but there are swords. there are battles.
The battles are with the inner demons.
That's right.
Yes.
They're with attachment.
Yeah. And then I'm doing another series that I can't talk about, but it's about problem solving in creative ways.
All right. Cool. Very, you're teasing us. All right, cool. So yeah, so everybody who's listening to this, JJ, I know you're still here. Go check out Sarah's stuff. Check out that show. Check out the game. It's going to be awesome. Cody from the future here. Sarah's new project Heist is out pretty much now, July 14th. So go check it out. It's about, as the logline says, ordinary people getting away with extraordinary heists. Sarah's the best, as you guys can tell by now. So go check that out.